it's Shira from Woodshop Diaries, and today I'm going to show you how I built this writing desk / large work table with a couple of drawers and plenty of room to work at. So if you guys are ready to get building, let's go. Towards the end of last year, I built several different types, sizes, and styles of desks, but I never built one quite like this. It's a pretty basic build, nothing super fancy, but it's really nice because unlike my other desk designs, this one has a pretty large work surface and can be used as a writing desk or even as a table. So if you're needing something similar for your home or office, I'll show you how to build one in this video. For dimensions, details, and materials list, check out the plans linked below. But keep watching right here to see how it came together. I built this desk using birch plywood and pine wood. My parents and I didn't really care to make this any more difficult or expensive than it needed to be, so we didn't mind using some cheap lumber. However, if you're not a fan of pine, feel free to use any type of wood that you prefer for this project. To get started, I needed to glue up the posts to use for the legs. I just laminated 2 pieces of 2x4 together to make the legs, but before gluing them together, I did trim them down to the rough length and then cut about 1/8 of an inch off each edge to square them up. Then I glued 2 together for each of the 4 legs. Once the glue had dried, I trimmed another 1/8 of an inch off each edge to clean up the glue joints and also to give me a true 3x3 overall size post. Then I trimmed these leg posts down to 30 inches on the miter saw. As an optional step, I also added a taper to the ends of the legs. To do this, I just adjusted my miter angle to 60 degrees on my saw and cut 2 sides so that they tapered to the middle of the leg like shown here. I did that for all 4 posts, and then I set them to the side. Now that the legs are ready, I needed to get the desk aprons ready to begin assembling the frame of the desk. I have a ton of random 3/4 inch plywood scraps that I really need to get rid of, so I dug around and found a piece that I could rip down to use for the sides and back of this desk. However, if you're starting from a full sheet of plywood, you can simply rip a strip off of your sheet to use for these aprons. I ripped these pieces down to 6 inches wide and then trimmed them to length on the miter saw. Once everything was sanded, I drilled pocket holes into the ends of the aprons and began assembling the 2 sides. I was adding some trim to the desk in a later step, so I installed the aprons 3/4 inches in from the outside edge of the legs. That way, when I add the trim later, it'll all be flush to the outside. I used a scrap block here to help keep my spacing correct. Also, do keep in mind that if you tapered your legs here like I did, it's important to make sure to face the tapers toward the inside of the desk. Once the 2 sides were together, I added the back apron the same way, 3/4 inches inset from the outside edge of the legs and using pocket holes and screws. Now, since I was adding drawers to the front side, I didn't install a normal apron here. Instead, I ripped 2 more strips of 3/4 inch plywood to 3 inches wide and installed with pocket holes and screws like you see here. Notice that I also edge banded the front edge of these pieces as they will be showing in the finished project. The top edge was added flush to the top of the legs, with the bottom piece I installed so that the bottom edge was 6 inches from the top of the legs so that it would match the spacing on the 6-inch thick sides. Once the main frame was together, I began adding the bracing for the drawer slides and drawers. I used more scrap plywood for all of these bracing pieces along the top and installed them using pocket holes and screws. Again, for all the dimensions and the placement locations for this project, be sure to see the plans linked below. After all of the top bracing was attached, I added some bracing inside the desk. I again used some scrap plywood for this. Now the width of the pieces on the far left and the far right aren't too important here, but the middle two pieces do need to be ripped to the exact distance that the front pieces are apart. In this case, it was 4.5 inches. I used pocket holes and screws to attach the two braces on the left and the right so that they were mounted flush to the inside of the legs like shown here. Then I evenly spaced the two pieces in the middle and attached the back side to the back apron using pocket holes and screws. The front of these pieces should be 1.5 inches inset from the front edge of the frame. Once I ensured that they were all evenly spaced from the front to the back, I clamped in place and used some wood screws to secure the front to the frame pieces and added a couple along the top as well. Now that all of the bracing is in place, it was time to add the slides. I installed 3 pair of 16-inch ball bearing drawer slides onto these braces, keeping them 1.5 inches inset from the front edge of the desk. Now, if you're interested in learning more about building drawers and installing slides, I've got a super detailed guide that I will link below that might be helpful. Once the slides were in, it was time to build and install the drawer boxes. I went back to my scrap plywood pile and dug out some pieces to use for the drawer boxes. I ripped them down to about 4 inches wide, cut a dado along the bottom, trimmed them to length on the miter saw, and then cut some 1/4 inch plywood bottoms to fit inside. Then I assembled the boxes using pocket holes and screws. To install them into the desk, I used some scrap 1/4 inch plywood as a spacer underneath the boxes and screwed them into the slides. Again, for more details on building and installing drawers and drawer slides, I will link a helpful guide below. Next, it was time to add the top. I cut the top from a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood, and I used my Kreg cutting guides and circular saw for this. But since my rip cut only goes to 24 inches wide and I needed this top to be 36 inches wide, I just adjusted it to 12 inches and cut 12 inches off my 48-inch sheet to give me a 36-inch wide piece left over. Then I used my Kreg AccuCut to trim this piece to length. Once I made sure that the top would fit, I applied iron-on edge banding to cover all the plywood edges and sanded it well. I placed the top upside down on the ground and flipped the desk over on top of it. I checked all the corners to make sure that I got it good and centered on the top, and then I used wood screws to secure the top in several places through the top supports. All that's left now is the finishing details. Now, all the trim that I added here is totally optional, but I do think that it makes the piece look a little bit better with just a little bit of extra effort. First, I cut to fit 1x2 boards to glue and nail along the top and bottom edges of the sides and back of the desk. Once these 1x2s were in place, I lined the inside of these frames with cove molding cut to fit on the sides and back. And finally, I added some half round molding along the bottom edge all the way around the desk. actually intended on adding some more cove molding along the top edge of the desk where the frame meets the top panel. But I ran out of cove molding and I really didn't want to go into town for more. But if you wanted to add some more, I think it would look really nice. And the last part of this project is adding the drawer fronts. Now, even though the front was drawers and the sides and back were solid, I wanted them to match. So for the drawer fronts, I cut 3/4 inch plywood the size that the fronts needed to be, and I added some trim on top to match the sides. To do this, I cut square 3/4 inch dowels to frame the edges and glued and nailed them on top of the plywood drawer fronts. Then, just like with the sides and back of the desk, I lined the inside with cove molding. I just glued these cove molding pieces in place, but you could nail them too if you wanted. I did use some painter's tape in a couple of places just to hold the cove molding pieces in place until the glue dried. Then I spaced these drawer fronts out on each drawer, leaving about 1/8 of an inch gap around all of the edges and screwed them in place with wood screws from the inside of each drawer box. To finish this off, I gave it a few coats of clear poly and added some black handles. Now, I actually wanted to paint this piece since the wood colors didn't exactly match each other, but my mom really wanted to leave this natural and the customer is always right. So just a few coats of clear poly finished it off. I do like the light colored wood here, but I do wish that I had picked 2x4s that were a little less pink. Besides the mismatched wood colors, I'm really happy with how this project turned out, and I think it would make a nice desk, but also a nice craft table, or even a rolling kitchen island if you wanted to put some casters on the bottom. If you're interested in building one of these for yourself, be sure to check out the plans linked below, and if you enjoyed this project, I would love it if you would subscribe so you don't miss out on the projects to come. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy building!